Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Big Bass Podcast. My name is Terry Battisti.
And I'm Ken Duke. Our producer and engineer is Nathan Benson. Before we kick off this episode of the Big Bass Podcast, we need a small favor. If you're coming back to the show because you've enjoyed previous episodes, please click the subscribe button right now. It'll help us grow the show and allow us to continue bringing you the stories of the world's biggest and most interesting bass.
And if you're checking us out for the first time and you like what you hear, subscribe and click on the bell icon so you'll be notified each time a new episode posts. We do a show every week. It drops Tuesday nights, and we really need your support. We also hope that you'll check out the website, thebigbasspodcast.com, and what you're going to find there are all of our shows and special bonus material like the Big Bass Calculator and lists of all the state and world record bass, pretty much smallmouth, largemouth, and spotted bass right now, and we'll be including also every single other type of black bass that there is in the world.
Okay, let's get started. Terry, this episode is all about Fritz Friebel, the angler who held the world record for heaviest largemouth bass before George Perry's 22-pound 4-ounce catch back in 1932. In fact, Fritz Friebel was really bass fishing's very first world record holder.
Yeah. People have been fishing bass since the 1700s, but, up until, maybe the 1900s, nobody really cared, how big a fish was. They were more interested in eating these things than to, get accolades for being a record. And the interesting thing is that we're recording this episode almost exactly at the 100th anniversary of the catching of this fish, which is pretty cool in my eyes.
I agree, man. We waited until this year to start the podcast because we were waiting for the 100th anniversary.
Exactly.
Actually, not true, but worked out that way. The Fritz Friebel story is absolutely one of my favorites in all of bass fishing. A lot of anglers know about George Perry, of course, and his world record bass from Georgia, but only the most passionate about bass fishing history are aware of Fritz Friebel.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, you're talking about a fish that's 100 years old, right? And the only thing that people for the last, 80 years have been trying to break is George Perry's record. So why would they dig back further, and discover that Fritz Friebel, existed and actually caught a 20-pound fish out of the state of Florida?
We're going to tell them why they need to know about Fritz.
Yep.
Interesting guy, and one of the first things I was digging into, Terry, looking into his genealogy and so forth, is I have a little confusion about the man's name, believe it or not. He was born on June 6th, 1893 in Brooklyn, New York. And every piece of official documentation I can have says his name is Fritz Joseph Friebel. That's on his draft registration card. That's on his marriage license. That's even on his headstone. But whenever his family referenced him, they said his name was Frederick Joseph Friebel, not Fritz, but Frederick.
Yeah.
And it was confusing.
Oh, I can imagine, and you're right. I've done digging on this too, and have read stuff that his nephew has written about him, and his nephew called him, Frederick Fritz Friebel. So, I'm going to go with the family. And
well, the family kept calling him Frederick, but we're going to call him Fritz because everybody apparently called him Fritz, and that was the name he liked to go by.
Yeah.
So we'll call him Fritz. And Fritz was the son of Oswald and Anna Friebel, who were both born in Germany. They immigrated to the U.S. in 1890 and settled in Brooklyn, New York, where Fritz was born 3 years later in 1893. Fritz's dad was a knitter. He worked in the clothing industry. He made sweaters and socks and underwear. His mother was a homemaker. They had 7 kids, and Fritz was right in the middle. He had 2 older sisters and brother, and he had 2 younger sisters and a brother. Mm-hmm. The family moved around a lot, Terry, I guess as immigrants did probably back at that turn of the century time.
Those were tough times. I mean, you did what you can. So
very tough times. America was coming out of depression in the late 1880s and early 1890s, and work was hard to come by. And so they moved around a lot while Oswald, the dad, was trying to find work and get better pay. One thing, and this German family, they like beer. You know, beer comes from Germany. And Oswald liked to drink beer, and he had a very favorite watering hole in Brooklyn. He used to stop there for a few beers every payday. And in 1902, he happened to bump into a guy who was painting the back bar at Fritz's favorite drinking hole. And that meeting changed the Friebels' lives forever. The painter told Oswald that he was moving to Florida, that there was all kinds of opportunity in Florida, and that he could afford a house there. And it sounded like a dream to the Friebel family. Yeah. So they started saving up money, and they made the move. Oswald stayed behind for 11 months after sending his family down to Florida on a steamship. They traveled in steerage with like farm animals, and they made it all the way to Jacksonville. And from there, they took a freight train to a little town not far from Tampa called San Antonio.
I can't imagine what that must have been like. I mean, that just must have been excuse my French, the shittiest time in the bogs of the boat. I mean, with livestock. I mean, holy crap.
Yeah, not a very auspicious beginning for the Friebel family, but they did better than okay. They did better than okay. Fritz actually attended 3 years of college, undergrad school at St. Leo in San Antonio, Florida. We don't know what he studied, but he was a well-educated man for his day. In 1917, just before he turned 24 years old, he registered for the military draft, and then he enlisted in the U.S. Army. He served during World War I in France as a sergeant first class. And I think it's kind of funny that a guy named Fritz was over in France fighting the Germans.
Well, and that's an interesting thing, because one of my other problems is I'm really into World War II history. And if you were German American, so he would have been first generation German American, they sent those people to fight. Yeah, you know where my head is. They sent those people to fight in the Pacific. And the Japanese Americans that didn't go into the internment camps, they went and fought in Europe. So there was no crossover. And but you never did find anything about it, because we did have German internment camps too. So
right, and this, of course, was World War I. Maybe the practices were different in World War I. Yeah. But he did serve in France, according to the best information I can find.
Yeah, they may have just needed anybody they could get.
Even before he enlisted in the Army, he was working for a company in Tampa called the Knight and Wall Company. They made hardware. And he would ultimately work there for 40 years. He spent his entire working career at Knight and Wall Hardware Company. He started as a bookkeeper. He was a clerk. He was a driver. Then later he was a traveling salesman, and eventually a sales manager. During the time he was a traveling salesman, his territory was Central Florida. And he used to carry his fishing gear and fishing clothes with him as he made his rounds. And during hunting season, he carried a gun. So he was really into the outdoors.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, if you could do it, and back in those days, the road sucked. And, it took you probably 2 days to go from Tampa to Orlando, right? I mean, they didn't have Highway 4.
That's true. No I-4. I don't know. I-4 might be slower than the roads they had back then.
And no tolls.
Yeah. But Friebel's story about traveling with his rod, his gun, reminds me actually of my grandfather, who came along about 9 or 10 years after Friebel and lived a very similar lifestyle in Alabama. By the time of the 1920 census, when Fritz Friebel would have been 27 years old, he was married to Estelle Anna Hackney, and they had 3 daughters together.
And we're going to have to look that. He said Hackney, folks, as in Greg Hackney, and I'm wondering if there's a lineage there. I don't know.
Well, this Estelle Hackney was from Georgia, for whatever that might be worth. Fritz was apparently a really good baseball player. He was a 5'6", 160-pound shortstop, and according to his family, he had an offer to play in the Cincinnati Reds farm system. So the man was an athlete. He also played, coached, and managed semi-pro baseball for years, even after he had a lot of his fishing accomplishments. Yep. He was also a good tennis player and golfer. But again, his passions were fishing and hunting. His wife, Estelle, died very young in 1943. She was just 51 years old. And 2 years later, Fritz remarried. He remarried a woman named Danny Mae Sheely, who lived 2 doors down from him, and she was 20 years younger than Fritz. So she was basically the same age as his daughters when they got married. So Fritz Friebel folks had game. And Terry, I think, as we all know, chicks dig lunkers.
They do. They dig lunkers. It's all over Instagram.
It's got to be. That's why we do this show, folks.
Oh, man. So
Here we are.
So let's go on a little bit about the catch of what we know. I mean, it was caught in 1923, so it's difficult to get too much. But what do you know about the how he caught the fish?
Well, yeah, as you said, we don't know much. One of the things I always like to look into when we dig into these things is what was the weather like that day, and the weather records don't go back that far, or I can't find them going back that far. But since this fish, and there's a little bit of controversy over exactly when this fish was caught, as far as what month. It was either middle of May or middle of June, 1923. Yeah. But being a Central Florida guy, lived here most of my life, I can tell you it would have been hot.
Really?
Would have been hot. May, June. Yeah. Would have been hot. Well, we do know a little bit about his tackle, though, but not a lot. We know that his lure was a Creek Chub Pikie minnow in the original 700 series. Mm-hmm. And Terry, as you know, that was the #1 bait that Creek Chub ever made.
Yep.
They sold millions and millions of those baits, and they started making them in 1920. You tell us about the size of that bait. It's pretty good size.
Yeah, it has no joint. It's 4.5 inches long, metal lip, 3/4 of an ounce. And in 22, I believe it came in 6 colors. But we don't know the color of what Friebel, was throwing that day. Here's an interesting thing for you people that, are students of James Henshaw. He was using a 4.5-foot casting rod, and Henshaw was a proponent of rods that were 8 feet or longer. It wasn't until the turn of the century that guys throwing pork frogs and stuff like that, they had pork rind back in the turn of the 19th century, throwing pork frogs into bushes and stuff, that they found that the smaller rods were way more accurate. And so he was fishing a 4.5-foot rod, which was, a little short for the day because it was 4.5 to 5 foot. So. But, yeah, that's what he was using. The reel that he was using, we don't know. We don't know the line that he was using. So, but.
Yeah, just a lot lost to history. We've been through hundreds of articles, manuscripts, and stuff like that trying to find this out, and some of it's just missing.
Yeah.
We do know who he was fishing with that day. He was out there with his brother-in-law, a guy by the name of Matt Klassen, and his brother-in-law's friend, a guy named Alan Pratt. And apparently Friebel did not know Alan Pratt well. They'd either just met for this fishing trip or were only mildly acquainted. Where we get a lot of information, ironically, Terry, is in an area that you're very passionate about. Folks, Terry is a collector of old tackle and especially lure catalogs.
Yeah. And I would say I'm a novice collector. I'm going to the NFLCC meets and stuff like that. These guys blow me away with what they have. And my collection it pales in comparison to a real collector. So I'll never call myself a true collector, but I appreciate, all these catalogs from the 20s, 30s, 40s, et cetera.
In 1925, Terry, just about a year and a half after Friebel catches this giant bass, 20 pounds, 2 ounces, Creek Chub comes out with their 1925 catalog. And there is an article in there, an essay, and it's called Smashing a World Record. And the byline is by Fritz J. Friebel. And it's hilarious. Mm-hmm. It's hilarious. I'm not saying it's not accurate. I'm sure that a lot of aspects of it are accurate. But I have a really hard time believing that these are Fritz Friebel's actual words as he put them down on paper. It starts like this, and I get such a big kick out of this. On the afternoon of June 15th, 1924, which was wrong. It was 23. Everybody knows it was 23. There are published reports in 23 about the catch, so there's already a mistake, which leads me to believe Friebel may have never seen this text before.
Exactly.
But on the afternoon of June 15, 1924, M.A. Klassen, Alan Pratt, and I began a motor trip after the high leaping green chaps of our southern waters.
I.e. the bass.
Yeah.
High leaping green chaps. That's how I refer
Yeah,
to
high
them.
leaping green chaps. Yeah.
You think we can get bass masters to start referring to them like that?
Yeah, folks, that's bad prose, even if it were in a British trout publication, okay? That's bad prose, even for there.
Oh, my gosh.
We motored to our favorite fishing waters in Pasco County, a lake known as Moody Lake. We're going to get into Moody Lake in just a little bit, but that's the first indication that it's coming from Friebel's mouth, allegedly, that he was fishing Moody Lake. And immediately there are two boats there. They've brought one boat, and they found another boat there in the middle of this pasture, and Friebel's brother-in-law, Matt Klassen, is in that boat. He's got a rod and reel he's fishing with. Friebel and Pratt are in another boat. Friebel is fishing. Pratt is paddling. He ain't fishing.
That's the way it was, right?
That's the way it was. We're going to find out that same story in the George Perry episodes that we'll do coming up. But yeah, one guy's fishing, one guy's paddling. There's no
I mean, is there a flip of the
Ultrex?
Is there a flip of the coin? I mean, who gets stuck with the paddle? I mean,
I have no idea how that worked out, but Friebel's casting, Pratt is paddling, and it's slow. They've got a couple little fish to show for their efforts, and so Friebel says, "Hey, paddle over here to this big patch of lily pads." And when they go over there, they see that that's where Klassen is, and Klassen's already caught a couple of good fish. One that weighed about 6 pounds and one that weighed about 9 pounds.
Yeah.
Friebel says they're both using their favorite lure,
mm-hmm.
which is that number 700 Creek Chub Pikie.
Yep.
And he really likes this area that they've pulled into. They get about 50 yards away from Klassen. They find an area, a circular ring of open water that's completely surrounded by lily pads. And Friebel says it's just the place for the haunt of a big bass.
A haunt.
There you go. So,
yeah,
we want to take you through the cast though. Here, and so these are the words of Fritz Friebel allegedly. I think all we can reasonably hope is that they're factually accurate, so we can get a feel for what went on that day. He said, "I made a cast to one of the boundaries of the pads without the slightest warning, and of a sudden, the water churned into an immense circle of suds, which led me to believe that an alligator had actually taken the bait. Immediately, Mr. Pratt proved that in fishing emergencies, he can keep a cool head. Recognizing the nature of the mighty churn in the water, he dropped his paddle and seized the lily pads near him with both hands, this holding the bow of the boat securely in position. And having heard the mighty commotion in the water, Mr. Klassen, who was near, yelled loudly, 'Hold him, boy! Hold him!' I might remark that what he had advised was my earnest intention."
God.
Terry, next time you and I go fishing together, if you hook one, which is unlikely, I want to say, "Hold him, boy! Hold him!"
Well, not only that, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write the prose. I guess I need to take some writing lessons from this. This is horrible.
The fight goes on. And it's a pretty good battle. Friebel's talking about how he's not able to stop this fish at all.
Yeah.
He's actually, these old reels of the day, they didn't have a drag system. They were basically always in free spool. If you wanted to stop it, you needed to clamp your thumb down on that spool and hold it.
Yep.
Well, not only is Friebel clamping his thumb down on the spool, he's got another thumb on the line and pressing it against the rod. So he's got essentially two drag systems going here, Terry.
Yeah. Well, but the other bad thing is that we're not talking about mono here. That's smooth. No, we're talking about linen line. I mean, it's and one of the things you'll see a novice do on an ocean boat is they'll hook a tuna or something like that, and their drag is set right. The fish is peeling, line off the spool, and their instant, reaction is to clamp down on and I've seen more blisters worn on thumbs, and that's what's essentially happening to Friebel here.
Yeah, actually, it was maybe even worse than that. According to the way Friebel put it here, he said the line was zipping outward with such speed and venom that it actually cut my thumb in 3 places, almost as though it had been a razor.
Yeah.
So he's got a gash on his fingers now from fighting this fish, which is still got a ton of fight in it. This fish is jumping. He's shaking his head like a mad bulldog and churning the water. The appearance behind the footlights suggested the break of a tarpon. You know, on and on and on. He made another mighty leap and another great churning splash, almost enough to bring a fellow's thumping heart flying from his throat. So he's all this purple prose about the fight of this fish. But finally, he starts to wear the fish down. Finally, the runs are shorter. The runs are a little less vigorous. It was not until 15 to 20 minutes of the battle had passed that at length he came to the surface of the water with his great mouth wide open. Carefully, and watching out for another wild rush, I reeled him up to the boat. He was then lying upon his side. Slowly, I worked him to the stern of the boat without thought of the risk taken. Remember, this bait, he's got a bait with 2 treble hooks in his mouth.
At least 2 treble hooks.
At least 2, maybe 3, depending on the model. But without thought of the risk taken, Mr. Pratt placed both hands in the fish's mouth, dragging the great chap, there's chap again, dragging the great chap right into the boat. Again, friend Pratt proved that he was equal to anything that might need a cool head in fish warfare. Fish warfare, Terry.
Yeah.
We're in fish warfare now.
I have no words for this. This is just awful. This is worse than a Bella Lugosi.
It's either awful or it's the greatest thing ever. I vote for greatest thing ever.
Oh, you're weird.
Well, finally, Pratt grabs his fish, I assume by the lower jaw, with both hands. You know, it's probably got a mouth the size you could pump a basketball down it. And he throws it on the deck of the boat. Got to be a flat-bottomed wooden John boat style boat. And he said he thumped the bottom of the boat as if it was his intention to drive out the planks. He's just pounding it with his tail.
Yeah.
We actually tied him down.
How do you do that?
Terry, suspended disbelief. We're watching a movie here.
Yeah.
For fear he would leap out, although that probably was not likely, Friebel says.
Yeah.
So they get this thing in the boat, and then, of course, it's the biggest fish they've ever seen, obviously. It's the biggest fish almost anybody had ever seen to this point. Although, folks, go back and check out our H.W. Ross episode, the very first episode of the Big Bass Podcast. We will put a link either here or somewhere. They decide they're going to stop fishing at that point, Terry. So they immediately head back to where their vehicles parked.
Put them in the live well.
Great camp. Well, they got him tied down to the bottom of the boat.
Yeah.
They think he's safe. He's probably down in steerage. At this point
with the cows.
Yeah, and so they Fritz has got scales. He carries fish scales with him, spring-loaded type scales. They put him on those scales, and the fish weighs 20 pounds and 2 ounces. And they think that's great, but let's get a better number. They break camp. They load everything back up in the vehicles. They start to haul their way from Moody Lake, which may not have been Moody Lake, and they're heading for the town of San Antonio, which is about 12 miles away. But they're not going to make it in 12 minutes, probably, because these are old dirt country roads, and certainly not traveling at the speeds that any of us could travel today. They got him to a grocery store in San Antonio, Florida. They put him on a set of Toledo certified meat scales. And on those meat scales, he weighed 1910. So he had lost 8 ounces over the course of a few hours. And of course, he's drying out. Naturally, he's going to lose quite a bit of weight.
He only lost 8 ounces. I mean, that's not that much.
Not bad.
So, yeah, that's pretty good. So
and we know a fair amount about the dimensions. And since you are the king of judging bass weight based on dimensions, nobody does it better, folks, than Dr. Terry Battisti. Take us through it, Doctor.
Yeah, so the bass...
While I drink.
Bottoms up. So the fish was 31 inches in length, and it was 26 and 5/8 of an inches in girth. And the perpendicular line from the top of the back in front of the dorsal fin down to the bottom of the belly was 11.5 inches, which is nuts. I mean, who takes these kind of measurements? You know, you're lucky to get a girth measurement these days out of a fish.
Yes.
And we know people are collecting the data to make models. Anyway, so the weight was 20 pounds, 2 ounces on Friebel's spring scale, 19 pounds, 10 ounces a few hours later on a Mettler Toledo scale, which were scales that were actually made in Germany, I believe, and they were really, really accurate. They had to be selling meat at the meat store. And we put those numbers into the Big Bass podcast calculator, and the number that it spits out is 19.72 pounds, or 19 pounds, 12 ounces roughly. And then if you adjust the length to girth ratio for that fish was 1.16. And if you look at the error for fish that have a 1.16 length to girth ratio, the model actually underestimates them by 4%. So if you add 4% to that, the fish is estimated to have weighed 20 pounds, 8 ounces. And if you take the average of 20 and 3/4 and 28, it gives you 20 pounds, 2 ounces, which makes me feel pretty freaking important.
Well, rightly so. I mean, your Big Bass podcast calculator predicts the Friebel weight to the ounce.
To the ounce.
To the ounce. Not only showing people how good this calculator is, but lending a lot of credibility
to Friebel,
to the reported weight of this fish.
Yeah, absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Now,
but you got to point out that that model that's on the website, the Big Bass Podcast Calculator, is only good for fish over 14.5 pounds. So if you've got a 12,
we're going to work on that.
Yeah, we are currently obtaining data for fish of a bunch of different dimensions, and we'll be actually making new models for certain size slot fish. So,
meanwhile, folks, the real message here is you need to catch fish that weigh 14 pounds or more.
Yeah,
and isn't that the answer for all of us?
Exactly.
What's interesting to me about the weighing story, several things which we're going to get into, but one thing I love about this story is Friebel was so proud of this fish. He knew he had something special. He froze this fish in a block of ice and kept it on exhibition in downtown Tampa in a storefront window for a few days. When the block of ice was no longer replenishable easily, they took the fish home and they ate it. So nothing was wasted. And as you know, Terry, what do you do with record fish?
You eat them.
You eat them.
Yeah.
At least that be a lesson to everyone here.
At least he didn't catch it on a flipping wad of cheese. Holy crap.
So now we got Fritz Friebel with this 20-pound, 2-ounce largemouth bass. Massive by any standards. Massive today. Massive certainly in 1923. But let's put this thing a little bit in perspective, Terry. At the time of the catch, Fritz Friebel's bass was generally regarded as the largest ever caught. When anybody referred to a giant bass preceding Friebel's as maybe the biggest up to that point, they usually were referring to a fish from Lake County, Florida, caught in 1922, just a year earlier, by a guy named O.C. Donahue that weighed 1815. And what's going to happen to Friebel's fish, we can go into some detail here in a bit, but what's going to happen to Friebel's fish is it's going to stay in that limelight for just a very few years.
Yep.
And then a couple of other largemouth bass that were reported are going to kick it out of the spotlight.
What's got me is it goes back to our first podcast. Where is H.W. Ross's fish in all this?
Yeah.
I mean, holy mackerel. Henshaw should have known about Friebel's fish, right? He knew about that.
Well, Henshaw would have known about Friebel's fish, I think, but he was really getting up there. He was in his 80s.
Yeah.
Maybe not on top of his game.
He was writing his biography for Field and Stream, for crying out loud, at that point.
Yeah, it was to the end of the biography period.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was around. He certainly should have known about the fish, likely knew about the fish. Yeah.
Yeah, he wasn't going to say anything about it because, he had caught a 20 also, right? Anyway.
Absolutely. He caught a 20 also in 1878 of all times.
Yeah.
But
we digress.
Yeah. Just a year after Friebel's catch, there's a piece in Field and Stream. 10 years after Friebel's catch, there's a piece in Field and Stream paying tribute to a fish allegedly caught in 1926 by a guy named George J. Nichols out of the Tombigbee River in Alabama that allegedly weighed 24 pounds. And if you ever want to know that a world record claim is for largemouth bass is false, just when you see it says Alabama, you know it's not true. Just not going to come from there. It's not going to come from there. But, you know, interesting too that Field and Stream commented on Nichols' bass in 1933. That was after Perry's bass too.
Yeah.
But since Nichols' bass was supposedly 24 pounds and Perry's bass was supposedly 22.4,
yeah,
you can kind of understand why they would do that. But that was an interesting world record publication, Terry. In the February 1933 issue, Field and Stream says the world record largemouth is 24 even, and the world record smallmouth is Walter Hardin, 14 even.
Yeah.
So, folks, check out the Hardin episode. We're going to put the link up here so you can find out about the 14-pound smallmouth that came out of Florida in the 1930s.
Exactly.
Oh yeah. And ultimately, we're going to talk about the Nichols fish somewhere down the road. That's another fascinating story. But ultimately, the Nichols fish was a total fraud. It was actually a striped bass that had been netted out of the Tombigbee waterway in the mid 1920s. The other guy who kicked Friebel out of the spotlight, of course, was George Washington Perry, who legend has it caught a 22.4 at a Montgomery Lake in Telfair County in June of 1932 and won the 1932 Field and Stream fishing contest.
Yep.
But what's fascinating to me, Terry, going back to weird Field and Stream stuff, those folks had such a hard time getting their act together. First of all, when they started publishing lists of record fish, they totally forgot about H.W. Ross.
Yep.
That they had a stake in back in 1884. And now they forget about
Fritz
Friebel.
Yeah.
Because, and they also forget about George Nichols because in 1934, in the January issue, they say, hey, the Perry's fish is the biggest we've ever heard of. Mm-hmm. Well, how come a year earlier you were talking about the Nichols fish?
Right.
Which was a pound and 3/4 more.
They must have changed editors or something.
I'll tell you what they did. They changed the guy who was writing the story.
Yeah.
They changed the guy who was writing the story, and chaos ensued. Field and Stream has a very spotty history with regard to their keeping of record fish. Mm-hmm. But we're going to have a whole lot more about George Perry down the road.
Yeah.
A whole lot more.
A whole lot more. Like 5 hours worth.
At least. At least. What I haven't told Terry yet is I'm planning like 10 Perry episodes.
Oh, God.
But, the Friebel fish, despite how well it does on your Big Bass Podcast calculator, the Friebel fish is not without some controversy. The 20-pound, 2-ounce number that everybody throws around with Friebel, and they say, yeah, his fish weighed 20 pounds, 2 ounces. That number was on a spring-loaded scale that belonged to Friebel himself. That was not on a certified scale.
Yeah. Yeah. So
what makes me feel good about it is your numbers on the Big Bass Podcast calculator.
Yeah. It was a big fish. I mean, it was a big 19-pound or a short 20-pound fish. We don't know how long it was out of the water. I mean, everybody knows that even a fish in water, if it dies, it's going to start losing weight real quick because even in water, it dehydrates. They lose all sorts of, liquid in their body, the whole 9 yards. We don't know how long it took for him to actually go from the lake to get it weighed on that certified scale. 8 ounces.
No, but I'm a buyer at 20 pounds, 2 ounces. I'm a buyer. I believe it.
Yeah.
Partly because the man weighed it on scales that he probably probably checked to some degree to make sure they were right.
Yeah.
And mostly because your formula checks it out and verifies it, which is as good as certified scales to me.
Yeah.
Friebel caught this fish on a Sunday. And when by his own admission, as he says, he should have been in church. Mm-hmm. When they got to San Antonio, Florida, to weigh the fish at a grocery, this is in a 1952 article when Friebel was still alive. He said, I had to call a grocer to open his store to get the fish weighed. What Fritz doesn't tell us is that grocer was his brother, Walter. And that's who had to open the store.
So what you're saying is that the scales were loaded.
No. I'm not saying that at all. Hey, if you or I are going into some place to weigh a fish and we happen to have a relative who has a certified scale, we're not going to call somebody we don't know. We're going to call that sibling and get it done.
Yeah, so he's weighing heavy bass and he's charging more for that pound of meat, which really weighed only a half a pound.
Hey, folks, stick with me. Be a believer. Be a free believer. Free believer.
Oh God.
Free believer. Okay.
Yeah, free believer.
Now, Walter Friebel, Fritz's brother, was also the guy who signed the Field and Stream affidavit for the fishing contest. Now, here's what's really cool, and I really like about the story. After the fish hits the certified meat scales, and there's some people around. This is a big deal. Somebody there is saying, "Hey, I think you put lead sinkers in that fish." Friebel pulls out his pocket knife, guts the fish, and tells a man to put his hand in there.
That's balls.
That's balls.
Yeah. Don't call me a liar.
That's right. You don't see that at walleye weigh-ins. You don't see that from Leah True.
Or Sandy DeFresco.
I'm sorry. Yes, that's what I meant to say. Sandy DeFresco. We'll get to Sandy DeFresco and her diver's weight in a later episode. Stick with us.
Oh God.
So that's the weight controversy or the weight issue. There's also a location issue of all things, Terry. We know that Fritz Friebel said the fish was caught from Lake Moody. Mm-hmm. But his brother, years later, said that Fritz told everybody it was Moody Lake just to keep him away from where he really caught the fish.
Now, there's a bass fisherman.
Exactly. What do we see time and again from these guys who catch giant fish? We see deception.
Exactly.
Even if it's just good-natured, friendly, don't want more pressure on my water kind of deception. Mm-hmm. We see deception, and Fritz Friebel is apparently no different. According to Walter Friebel, who probably was in a great position to know, Fritz actually caught that fish from a lake on private property west of San Antonio. And that lake was called
Big Fish Lake. So imagine that.
Why wouldn't you always fish Big Fish Lake?
Yeah.
I mean, I would never go anywhere else.
So I lived in Idaho for a long time, and there was a bunch of creeks called Fish Creek. You'd go to Fish Creek, you'd never catch anything. And so...
Is this like the Greenland, Iceland thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Where Greenland is a horrible frozen tundra and Iceland's very nice?
Exactly. But you brought up another good point here about the deception thing, Ken, is I'm thinking that maybe he did catch this on a wad of cheese, and because he knew that Creek Chub would be paying his way for the rest of his life, he said he caught it on a Creek Chub, Series 700 bait.
Cheese only works in California.
Velveeta, wasn't about to pay him, royalties for, catching the fish on that. So why not go with Creek Chub? CCBO.
Cheese only works in the golden state of California.
CCBC.
Your home.
Yeah, exactly.
Or your birthplace.
Yep.
Believe it or not, Terry, there's a weird, I won't say it's a controversy, but there's a weird discrepancy in all the literature and the coverage that I've seen through the years about the date of the catch. A lot of places will say it's May 19th, and other places will say it's June 16th. Yeah. Both of those are on Saturdays. Mm-hmm. Friebel later came out and admitted he caught the fish on Sunday and said he should have been in church.
Yeah.
So we know it wasn't either of those dates. We got to move it back a day to get it on a Sunday.
Unless he was Catholic and he was going to Saturday evening mass.
Yeah, no, not so much. But since his own essay indicates that it was in June, and since the most contemporaneous report I could find of the fish, which was from the Tampa Daily Times in July of 1923, I think the best evidence we have is that fish was caught on June 17th, 1923. Fritz was 30 years old at that time.
Yep. Yeah. What can you do? I mean, you're given the data that you have, and you can only surmise, based upon the day that he said that he caught it and whether or not it was June or May. So,
yeah, and I think perhaps more than any other story we've done so far, Terry, and that'll change once we jump into the George Perry largemouth and the David Hayes smallmouth. But more than any other story we've covered so far, we've had to go to a multitude of different sources to piece together the Fritz Friebel story. Folks, I guarantee you we've gone through hundreds of articles and little snippets and little references here and there just to pick up a morsel, a speck of dust to try to bring this story to you. Like a lot of the guys who we will report on in this show, Fritz Friebel entered his fish in the Field and Stream fishing contest. And of course he won with his 20-pound, 2-ounce largemouth bass. In fact, he beat second place by more than 5 pounds. And Field and Stream recognized it as a world record. The 1925 Creek Chub Bait Company catalog that we were telling you all about earlier, we were quoting Fritz Friebel. It has this cool passage right at the opening. It says, "Gentlemen anglers all, please leap to your feet and throw your hats into the air. Rah, rah. To Mr. Friebel and his black bass. Again, in Field and Stream's great national fishing contests, the world's record is smashed into flinders. Mr. Fritz J. Friebel of Tampa, Florida, is the latest world record crasher with rod and reel and a mighty largemouth black bass."
Yeah, gentlemen anglers all. Nah, the women are at home, right?
Forget it, ladies. Forget it.
Yeah. I'd go over like a turd punch bowl today.
Yeah. But the purple prose of the day, it's hard. It's really hard to read, especially if it's paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of that stuff. But if you're only reading little snippets, it's kind of amusing. Yeah. One of the things that breaks my heart, Terry, as a Florida native, Florida resident, is that Fritz Friebel's catch is not the Florida record. It is listed as the uncertified state record, and I hate that.
Yeah. Well, and rightfully so. I mean, it probably should be the record. But I mean, go into the reasons why it's not. I mean, this kind of will give people the idea of the state that you live in.
I'm not comfortable with the way you said that. I happen to live in the best state in the union. Thank you very much. But yeah, that does explain a lot. Florida really didn't start keeping official state fishing records until about 1976. And at that time, and this is really a slap in the face of the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission, they admitted they didn't know about Friebel's fish. They admitted in print they didn't know about the fish.
Unbelievable.
So instead, they established a 19-pound fish from 1961 caught by W.A. Witt. We're going to put a picture of that fish up right now. They said this 19-pound fish from 1961 is our state record. And it never should have been the state record. It was no more certified than Friebel's fish. But that became the state record. And then in 1984, following a bunch of research, the publication of several articles about Friebel, longtime fishing editor at the Augusta Chronicle and great outdoor writer Bill Babb helped to get the Friebel fish established as the state record. And that lasted only a few years because, unfortunately, FWC, that's the Florida Freshwater Fish Commission, decided to change the rules yet again, and they set up a rule that in order to have a state record, your fish has to be inspected by somebody from the commission. And that knocked Friebel out of the record books yet again. Although he is, as we said, the uncertified state record.
Yeah. Yeah. You need to fire all those people and, get some people that actually know history. And I mean, how can you overlook a fish that was written up for, years? I mean, if they didn't know it, that's their fault.
Written up in their own official publication, Terry.
Yeah. Yep.
Florida Wildlife Magazine. I've got about half of the issues of Florida Wildlife Magazine. They go back to the 1947, I think. Terrific publication. But yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame when people don't know their own history.
Yeah.
And that's why Terry and I take a lot of pride in our passion for bass fishing. We try to know and appreciate the history.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know. It just irritates the heck out of me that the people that were setting the records back then didn't know the history themselves. I can't explain it.
It's ugly, but if we start pointing fingers at all the institutions in the world of fishing and bass fishing in particular, we will quickly run out of fingers, Dr. Battisti.
Yeah. Well, we might
Very
even
quickly.
Toes. I mean,
yeah, toes too.
I mean, between the two of us, we've got 40 fingers and toes. I mean,
yeah, we're going to run out.
Yeah.
That's not nearly enough.
No.
Well, let's bring everybody up to speed a little bit here. On November 26th, in 1965, in a Tampa, Florida hospital, Fritz Friebel died at the age of 72. He is buried in Myrtle Hill Memorial Park in Tampa. And we've got a picture of his headstone right here because, as Terry knows, I am creepy and I go to cemeteries.
Hospitals as they're dying too. Yeah.
No, I don't do that.
Can I get one more interview?
That's
out
macabre.
Of you, sir?
That's macabre. But I have gone to many a cemetery to get pictures of headstones because that's how creepy I can be, I guess.
Hey.
Moody Lake, which is where Friebel said he caught the fish, but probably did not, is now two lakes that share the name. They cover about 200 acres, almost exactly 200 acres, and they got divided in half when Interstate 75 was built right down the center of Moody Lake. So if you've ever been down I-75 heading toward that Tampa area, you have passed right over the place where Fritz Friebel said he caught the one-time world record largemouth bass. Now, Big Fish Lake, where a lot of people believe he actually caught the former world record, is part of the 8,100-acre Bartle Brothers Ranch. This is a ranch where they raise quarter horses and Brahma cattle, and Big Fish Lake once covered like 1,300 acres.
Wow.
But because of droughts, sinkholes, agricultural activities, and the natural evolution of the Florida landscape, Big Fish Lake has dwindled down to about 40 acres, 40.
That's insane.
So it's basically gone.
Yeah. Huh.
Terry, it's that time. What is the Terry Battisti takeaway from the Fritz Friebel story? First of all, let me ask you: are you a believer?
Yeah, I'm a believer. I'm a believer that he, I always question spring scales, and we've all questioned them our whole lives. They give a good estimate of what a fish should weigh, plus or minus, who knows.
10 pounds.
Yeah, in some cases, probably, yeah. Yeah, I believe.
Tell me
I believe it. I mean, I've seen the pictures. Well, picture. And
There's only one.
The story of him gutting the fish in front of a person that said it was filled with lead. Yeah, I believe it. On the certified scale, it weighed 1910. Yeah, I think he probably had a 20-pound, 2-ounce fish. Yeah, I believe it. I do.
Now, what we're going to get into deeper when we address the George Perry story is the question of whether or not Friebel's world record maybe should have lasted at least 50 years.
Yeah. That's going to be an interesting discussion. And like I said before, we got at least 5 episodes that we're going to cover. I mean, that's what it's going to take to cover Perry. It's just, there's so much into that story. Books have been written about it. You've written countless articles on it. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. So I don't know. What's your opinion of this whole thing, Ken? I know that it pains you that Florida does not have a record fish that's over 20 pounds. So, I mean,
if for no other reason than that, I'd like to see Friebel more formally recognized by the Florida Freshwater Fish Commission. But I'm going to sum this up because I feel like Fritz Friebel has gotten treated unfairly so many times.
Oh yeah,
and I want to tell what may be the most bizarre example of that. And Terry, I know you know the story, but for a long time, for many years, there was a wooden sign in a city park in San Antonio, Florida, and it commemorated Fritz Friebel's catch of a 20-pound, 2-ounce largemouth bass from 1923.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a wooden sign, and time and weather took their toll on that sign. Hurricanes took their toll on that sign until finally city officials took the sign down. I think probably sometime in the 1970s. In 2002, Friebel's family, led by a couple of his nephews, they asked the sign to be replaced, and they were even willing to pay for it.
Yep.
Now, these nephews lived in Ohio, and during the Depression, during the late 20s and early 30s, when times were really tough, they remember that their uncle used to bring them baseball gloves and toys and bats and things like that. And they thought he was just the greatest guy in the world. He was wildly generous in a period when people didn't have a lot of
a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of.
Exactly. So Uncle Fritz was that guy for them. And they wanted to repay him in some way by paying tribute to his catch. So the family and those nephews were willing to pay for a sign. So the family designed the sign, and they found a sign maker in Ohio who would build it. And it wound up being a 50-pound monument. and we've got a picture here of it. A 50-pound monument made of plastic and other weather-resistant stuff. It was really built to last.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, this is a picture of John Finn with the sign. He was the guy who really spearheaded this effort, one of the nephews.
Oh, God.
And it includes a carved likeness of an angler holding a yardstick and a giant bass. The problem with the sign,
unbelievable,
Terry, is that guy is not Fritz Friebel.
No.
Remember this guy?
No.
Remember this guy?
Yes, exactly.
That's W.A. Witt.
Wow.
Yeah, it's
even
him.
The family
it's him.
Even the
family.
From the grave.
Yes.
Oh my God.
The family. It's the family, and it's W.A. Witt again. W.A. Witt. It's him again.
Oh.
He stole Fritz's thunder in the 1970s because the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission didn't know about Fritz's bass, so they made Witt's smaller fish to state record. Now Witt is back again to mock Fritz Friebel. And we have only Friebel's well-meaning family to blame.
Wow.
This is great.
That is absolutely insane.
Isn't that horrible? So the nephew in the picture there, and I hope we got them both side by side. I'm sure Nathan can take care of us for that. The nephew there, John Finn, said of the carving on the sign, he said, "It looks a lot like him, but guess what? It's not.
It ain't him at all."
Fritz Friebel got screwed again.
Oh my God.
And that's my big takeaway.
Unbelievable. Well, Ken, I think it's time to slam the door on this episode of the Big Bass Podcast. But before we go, please remember, subscribe. It's how you can support the show and help us grow our audience. No one else is doing this kind of deep dives into bass fishing history, especially big bass, as it relates to, fish all over the United States and even the world. It's a lot of work, and without your support, we can't keep it going. So if you like what you've seen or heard so far, please give us a like, a share, leave comments. We've been loving for the past 3 weeks interacting with y'all on the the Facebook, or excuse me, the YouTube comments. That's been a lot of fun for us, and we're real happy with the comments that we've received so far. Don't forget to check out the website, bigbasspodcast.com. Again, you're going to find the Big Bass Calculator and listings of all the state record bass and every species and subspecies will be in the future. But for right now, it's spots, largemouth, and smallmouth, and all sorts of articles and links that you can go down these rabbit holes with us. And we're going to be updating the site with more of that here in the next probably 3 to 4 weeks. We're kind of playing catch up right now. So if you'd like to contact us, our email addresses are ken@thebigBassPodcast.com, Terry@thebigBassPodcast.com, and Nathan@thebigBassPodcast.com. I'm Terry Battisti, and on behalf of my partners Ken Duke and Nathan Benson, thank you again for joining us. And be sure to check back next week. We'll have a new show about a different big bass with a story that you will not and cannot find anywhere else. We guarantee it.